The ancient world left us a problem. Archaeologists dig up cities. They find pottery, bones, burned layers, and broken walls. But they rarely find the people the Bible names. For centuries, skeptics said the conquest of Canaan never happened. They said Israel appeared out of nowhere, a story invented late, with no footprints in the dirt. Then Egypt spoke. In 1887, a peasant woman digging near the Nile made one of the greatest accidental discoveries in history. She found clay tablets, hundreds of them, baked hard by the Egyptian sun, covered in strange wedge-shaped writing. These were the Amarna Letters, official diplomatic correspondence between Egypt and the city-states of Canaan, written during the reigns of Amenhotep III and his son, the famous Akhenaten, 14th century BC. And woven through these desperate letters, a name, a group of outsiders, causing chaos across Canaan: the Habiru. The word appears more than 200 times in ancient Near Eastern texts. It is not just Egyptian. It shows up in Mesopotamian records, Hittite documents, Ugaritic tablets, and Nuzi texts. Scholars have debated it for over a century. The Habiru were not a race. They were not a tribe. They were a social class, or perhaps a legal category. Displaced people, wanderers, outsiders who did not fit the established order, stateless groups who hired out as laborers, soldiers, and sometimes raiders. The word itself likely carries the meaning of one who crosses over, a border crosser, someone who does not belong. Now, does that sound familiar? The Hebrew word for Hebrew, Ivri, comes from the same root as Eber, meaning to cross over. Abraham himself is called the Hebrew, Ha-Ivri, in Genesis 14 verse 13. The one who crossed over. This is not a coincidence. This is a thread. Let us go back to those clay tablets. The Amarna Letters are urgent and frightened. The Canaanite city kings are writing to Pharaoh, begging him to send troops. Their land is being overrun. One king, Abdi-Heba of Jerusalem, writes again and again. He is desperate. He says his territory is being seized. He says the Habiru are taking the king's cities. He appeals directly to Pharaoh. Send me troops. Send me archers. Pharaoh never sends them. Now, when were these letters written? Mainstream archaeology dates the Amarna period to roughly 1360–1330 BC. As we established in our Jericho episode, the biblical text places the Exodus at 1446 BC and the conquest at approximately 1406 BC. Joshua crossed the Jordan and began taking cities a full generation before the Amarna Letters were written. By the time Abdi-Heba was writing his panicked letters to Pharaoh, around 1360 to 1340 BC, the conquest had been underway for decades. The city kings of Canaan had watched city after city fall. They were writing to Egypt about a crisis already in progress, and the label they used for the people dismantling their world, the Habiru. The letters do not describe the beginning of the conquest. They describe its ongoing momentum. That is why the early date framework makes the Amarna Letters such powerful evidence for verification. Abdi-Heba's letters deserve a closer look. He writes, "The Habiru are seizing the cities of the king. Not a single governor remains among the king's governors. All are lost. The king has no lands." He also writes a sentence that has arrested scholars for generations. He distances himself from the conquest. He says, "I did not take the land by force. My father did not give it to me. The mighty hand of the king established me." He is saying, "I am not like them. I am loyal. Pharaoh, you put me here. My throne is legitimate." The Habiru in these letters are not random bandits. They are organized. They are coordinated. They take entire regions, and city after city falls. And Egypt, at the height of its power under Akhenaten, does nothing. Why? Because his religious revolution at home consumed Akhenaten. He had reorganized the entire Egyptian state around the worship of the sun disk, the Aten. He had no bandwidth for Canaan. For Israel, that silence was the window God opened. Now, a second group enters the picture. Egyptian texts also mention a people called the Shasu. The word means roughly those who move on foot, wanderers, pastoralists, semi-nomadic tribal groups living east of Egypt, in the Sinai, the Negev, and the regions of Edom and Seir. The Shasu appear in Egyptian military and administrative records across several centuries. They were seen as a threat, a nuisance, and, at times, as laborers brought into Egypt. Now here is the critical detail. In a temple inscription from the reign of Amenhotep III, the same era as the Amarna Letters, a list of Shasu tribal territories is recorded. 6 names are given. One of them reads, Shasu of YHW. YHW, in Egyptian hieroglyphics, was written in stone. This is the oldest known extrabiblical reference to the divine name of Israel's God. The Tetragrammaton, Yahweh, appears on an Egyptian temple wall attached to a group of Shasu wanderers in the region of Seir and Edom before the conquest of Canaan. This is not a small thing. Scholars have wrestled with this inscription for decades. The most natural reading is that there was a Shasu tribal group in the region of Seir, ancient Edom, the wilderness southeast of Canaan, who were associated with, or named after, a place called YHW, which is itself named after, or connected to, the divine name Yahweh. The Bible itself connects this region to the early worship of Yahweh. Deuteronomy 33 verse 2 says, "The Lord came from Sinai and rose from Seir upon us." Judges 5 verse 4 repeats the same geography. Habakkuk 3 verse 3 echoes this. God came from Taman, the Holy One from Mount Paran. Seir, Taman, Paran. These are all in the same region, the wilderness south and east of Canaan, the same region where the Shasu of YHW are listed on the Egyptian inscription. The Israelites spent 40 years in that wilderness. The convergence here is remarkable. Egypt records a Shasu group in the YHW region during the period when Israel was wandering in the wilderness and preparing to enter Canaan. And then, in the same era, Canaanite city kings are writing panicked letters about Habiru taking their cities. 2 independent Egyptian sources. 2 pieces of the same story. Now we need to be honest about the debate. Not all scholars agree that the Habiru are the Israelites. Many argue that the Habiru were too widespread. They appear in documents from across the entire ancient Near East, long before and after the period of Joshua. If Habiru means displaced outsiders, then the label could apply to many groups. That is a fair point. The Habiru were not only Israelites. But here is the counterargument. It need not be an either-or. The Israelites, as they entered Canaan, would have appeared to Egyptian administrators exactly as the Habiru did, stateless outsiders crossing borders, without legitimate claim by the standards of the established order. The category fits. Think of it this way. If Egyptian scribes had to classify the invading Israelites using the categories available to them, Habiru was the closest match. The Canaanite kings were not writing theology. They were writing panic. They used the label that described what they saw. Similarly, the Shasu connection does not prove that all Shasu were Israelites. But it does show that people worshipping a deity named Yahweh were known to Egyptian records in exactly the region where the Bible says Israel spent the wilderness years. The 2 pieces fit. There is a principle in historical evidence that scholars call the criterion of embarrassment. When a source admits something that works against its own interests, that admission is more trustworthy, not less. Egypt had every reason to ignore Israel. Pharaoh had been humiliated by the plagues. An entire army had drowned in the sea. And yet, Egypt records the Habiru taking Canaan. Egypt records the name, Yahweh, in the wilderness region. Egypt records the panic of its own vassal kings. These are accidental witnesses. They were not trying to confirm the Bible. They were writing about their own problems. And in doing so, they preserved exactly the kind of external, hostile source corroboration that historians consider most reliable. The enemies of Israel became, without meaning to, witnesses for Israel. This is the God who works in history, openly, leaving fingerprints even in the archives of those who wanted to forget him. The Habiru did not know they were being written into history. The Shasu of YHW did not know their name would survive 3,000 years in stone. But God knew. The Bible has always claimed to be historical. It does not ask for faith disconnected from reality. It plants its story in real geography, real chronology, real civilizations. And when we go looking, we find it there. Not every question is answered. Archaeology is always incomplete. The silence of the ground is not proof that nothing happened. But piece by piece, the external world keeps confirming what the text already said. The Israelites were in Egypt. They were in the wilderness. They crossed into Canaan. And the nations around them recorded it, in their own words, in their own panic, for their own reasons, without ever meaning to hand us evidence. That is the kind of God the Bible describes. One who does not need to announce himself. One who leaves his name in the stones of his enemies. The Habiru were coming. The Shasu carried his name. And the land was never the same again. Now, the conquest is over. But the battle for Israel's soul is just beginning. Who were the gods of Canaan? Baal, Dagon, Molech. Where did they come from? And why did God hate them so fiercely? That series is next.